flying, kicking, lightning bolts. Things we're all familiar with in our classic American superhero movies. But wait, those don't seem quite like what we know, especially that flying? This effect seems to look incredibly strange to Western audiences. Although it is a staple effect for Chinese cinema, the way that it has been portrayed was strange enough to make people stop watching wuxia movies entirely. To understand this unique flying, we must understand wuxia, the culture behind it, and its evolution. All genres of Chinese cinema in the 1920s, action, comedy, dramas, musicals, incorporated special effects. They all took advantage of the technical limitations of the projector by undercranking, overcranking as seen in the speedy treatment that the Doctor gives in Labor's Love 1922, superimposing shots giving the illusion that characters are in fantastical settings, such as these actors on top of clouds in 1931's In Amour's History of the Silver Screen, painting over film to illustrate magic like these lightsabers in The Mighty Hero Ganfangji from 1928, and many more tricks to entertain viewers. Many of these techniques can be seen in fantasy martial arts films, also known as wuxia films. But what exactly is wuxia? Well, it is a unique culture that includes three parts: the swordsmen, wuxia ethics, and wuxia literature. The ethics emphasizes righteousness, having a strong sense of justice, and always being ready to help the weak, the ones in danger, and the ones in need. The literature records deeds or stories in oral and written form to spread these values. I'm sure that you've heard of at least one of them. To name a few, there's Journey to the West, also known as The Monkey King, Legend of the Condor Heroes, and Romance of the Three Kingdoms, this last one being a favorite of my dad's. This culture has always been deep-rooted in China, and it's still very much relevant today. It emerged during the Warring States period by scholars that came from the civilian class. They advocated martial arts to be chivalrous, full of feelings of patriotism and love for the people, as well as the reward and punishment of good and evil. Wuxia also combined the concept of in the world and beyond the world, and all these ideals contribute to its popularity and respect by the Chinese population. How exactly does this correspond to people flying? Well, to keep it brief, the martial arts that was spread during those days was Qigong, a technique that focused on lightness of the body. As you could have guessed, in cinema, it has greatly been exaggerated and evolved into flying. Now to get into it, how did they achieve this gravity-defying effect? The very first film to ever feature a flying person was The Red Heron in 1929, using Hong Kong wirework techniques to hold the actor in the air. You may notice that the shot seems awfully static and awkward. This can be explained by the fact that cameras were rarely ever moved to make the story easier to follow. The films needed to focus on a character's face or actions, since they couldn't rely on sound. Other than simple panning, Chinese cinema would stage their scenes around these wide shots. Another way to indicate flying was by animating a character's silhouette, as seen in Woman Warrior of the Wild River 6, Rumble at Deerhorn Gully. It is unknown if there are movies that use different techniques before and after the ones displayed here. At various times from 1912 to 1949, wuxia literature and film would suffer bans for inciting revolutions with their anti-authoritarian messages. Most have been lost eternally to government crackdowns, with only a handful surviving out of thousands of produced films, Red Heron being the oldest that could be restored. It is only in the 1960s, a few years after the ban was lifted, that these films resurged and the golden age of wuxia began thanks to the Shaw Brothers studio releasing classic after classic. Right off the bat, you probably noticed that this flying looks incredibly different from the ones seen in the previous films. A lot more movement, a lot more dramatic. In fact, they've let go of wires in this era, and opted for trampolines and well-positioned shots, giving the illusion that the characters are rapidly flying across the screen, as seen in A Touch of Zen 1971. As such, actors were also assuming the role of a stuntman, having to perform flips and other dramatic flares. This effect was cheap and easily accessible. In fact, even you could recreate it in your own home. This allowed for more creative fight choreography, considering trampolines can be moved and placed anywhere and at any time. Starting from the 1980s, studios restarted experimenting with wire techniques. The difference between the two was like night and day. With wires, the movement was a lot more elegant and natural. Furthermore, it allowed for wider shots and even more impressive action. The wires would be used to pull actors off screen in order to exaggerate the opponent's strength. As for flying, 10 to 15 martial artists would be dangling from wires hoisted on cranes up to 70 feet off the ground, and basically be thrown around like puppets. With greater effects also comes longer and more extensive prepping. Considering this technique required cranes to function, they had to prep areas taking into account their environment, and if the area was too steep to accommodate cranes, then the wires would need to be secured onto the surfaces of rocks and walls. The most intricate wire act in Curse of the Golden Flower 2006 required 4 months to prep. The scene required 30 actors to be hoisted in the air, doubling the usual amount of actors on wires over 600 feet long. Adding to its difficulty, it was filmed in a narrow valley, so every wire had to be secured onto the rock faces, calling for more than 200 wire riggers to continuously work on the set. Once it was finally ready, it took 15 days to shoot it. In my opinion, it was completely worth it. With all the workload attached to wire fu, it was obvious with the coming of CGI that movie producers would opt for it instead. As the saying goes, time is money, so they are in fact saving double the money. It also makes this a lot more accessible to actors and directors alike, but there are many who criticize this new technology for making these scenes a lot less realistic, and the lack of effort is apparent. This over-reliance on computer imagery can be seen in The Great Wall 2017, in which the combination of the less than realistic monsters, the obvious green screen, and the floaty actress make for a bizarre looking action scene, in which the weight of everything seems inconsistent. I wouldn't say that CGI is necessarily a bad thing for this type of effect. In fact, I believe that mixing it with traditional wire work definitely elevate it, as can be seen in any Yip Man movie. Even so, older films with only practical effects have a unique charm, especially when you discover the amount of time, effort, and coordination required by the entire team in order to execute them. I can't help to think to myself, wuxia may look a little silly, but it's also impressive as hell. Though, I can't stop wondering, what kind of techniques are lost, never to be known about due to those bans?